Okay, so according to my clock here, it is 2 o'clock. There are already a few of us in here, so I'm just going to get going. I will be monitoring the chat throughout this, so hopefully that will be all right for everybody. And if for whatever reason you can't hear me or can't see me, let me know, or the slides aren't working. Hopefully it's all good. I am Maureen Babb. I'm a science librarian here at the University of Manitoba. And today's session is Finding Scholarly Sources Without University Access. A session for graduating students and alumni, which is, I'm assuming, what most of you are. So what are we going to be covering today? We are going to be looking at, we're going to talk about the importance of having access to scholarly resources outside of the university context. We're going to talk about University of Manitoba Libraries Alumni Resources for those of you who are graduating or who have already graduated. We're also going to talk about open access scholarly material and how to find it. We'll talk about how effective information seeking differs from general search engine use, but we won't get too much into that unless I suppose people want more detail on it. So throughout your university career, you've been directed towards scholarly resources, peer-reviewed articles, that sort of thing. And scholarship, that sort of scholarly resource, is informed by original research, is informed by evidence, it's backed up, it's not just opinion pieces, that sort of thing. Scholarly writing, as you know, now that you're at the end of your undergraduate or graduate career, it's bound by these certain requirements that encourage honesty and accuracy in what you're presenting. So it's got proper citation, it's got descriptive and clear methodology, it's got placement of the information in a broader context, and it involves peer review, which means that it's, you've finished your draft and then you've sent it off to other experts in the field to have a look to make sure that what you're presenting is actually good. For lack of a longer way to word that. And so in school, in university, you're traditionally expected to use these scholarly resources for the reasons that I've just described above. It ensures tries to ensure a certain quality of information. So what happens when you leave university? Well, a lot of the stuff that you have access to in university is stuff that the university and the university library pays money for, pays a lot of money for. So you have access to a lot of material now that you will lose access to once you've graduated. And so you'll start, when you do a Google search for something and you see an article that you like and you go to the page and it comes up with like, oh, well, you can have access to this article for 24 hours for $40 or whatever. So you're hitting these paywalls again. And in university, we often teach you, like if you had a session from the libraries or even from your professor, they were probably pointing you towards library resources, saying like, hey, this is how to find information. So it's relying on the library website or library databases or this sort of thing. And while you're in university, that makes sense because that's where a lot of high quality information lives. And the databases are constructed for complicated searching. They're often subject specific. So there's good reasons for us pointing you towards these resources. But a lot of times when people leave university, first of all, they're not necessarily expecting to lose access to all this stuff because they sort of didn't realize that it was something that the university was providing access for. And so they start hitting the paywalls, but they're out there in the world and they still need quality information, either in their professional life or in their personal life, right? And so what often happens is without the resources available that you had in university, you're sort of lost. Where do I find this information? And you can revert to old search habits, or you can do, very basic Google searching and that sort of thing. And you sometimes end up relying on not great resources just because they're more accessible. There's an increased risk of bias now and that sort of thing because of what's accessible. And so a lot of people feel a little lost at sea at this point. And I'm hoping that what I cover today, and again, feel free to ask any specific questions if I don't cover anything that you were hoping to see here as we go along. And depending on your profession, if you have like a professional association or a professional organization that you're a part of, you may still have access to some specialized resources in your field through that organization. So that's always something worth checking as well. I'm not going to talk about that in any detail because of course that's very, very field specific. But know that that's potentially a place where you could be getting information as well. Now, I've talked a little bit about Google, and it's not necessarily that Google is itself bad or a bad way to get information, but Google or Google Scholar they're not curated resources. Like there's no real curation of information. There's a little bit in Google Scholar just because it's looking for material that looks scholarly, but it's basically just sending out its crawlers and pulling in resources. Most people use Google, and you can get good information from these, but you should be aware that the results that are being generated in your Google search are algorithmically based. That algorithm is proprietary, so I don't know what's in it. Basically, if you don't work at Google, you don't know what's in it. There are people who spend a lot of time and money trying to guess what's in it. And also, Google algorithms are personalized. So if you have a Google account or you're using the same computer and you're searching for the same sort of thing, or you're searching in a certain location, what you're seeing will be tailored based on those sorts of things as well. So your search history, your physical location, that sort of thing. But things that also influence what shows up in Google is marketing, keyword use, the popularity of something, and they say this is relevant, but it's not necessarily accurate. So just be aware if you're using Google and Google Scholar of that. So, okay, great. I've told you what some of the problems are. So where should you look for good information once you've graduated? And so for alumni, you have it a little bit easier than other people because we do continue to provide some access and some resources to our alumni folk. You can get an alumni library card to replace your student card and student login information. You can still borrow physical items from the library. When you're working off campus, when you're at home or in another country or whatever, you still have access to certain online resources. These tend to be a little humanities and social sciences heavy as opposed to the sciences or the health sciences. This is, I think as those of us who work at the university would love to be providing access to all of our resources for all alumni, but there are vendor relationships and vendor rules that are dependent on who owns the material and how much access they allow and how much it costs and this sort of thing. So we often can't provide off-campus access to alumni people. But if you decide to come in to campus, to a University of Manitoba campus, you can still use all of our electronic resources, all of our databases, that sort of thing, while you're physically here. And of course, that can be challenging if you, say, move to another city or another country, or also if you're trying to do a search, say, at work. You can't necessarily take time out of your day to come down to campus and have a look here. And you can also print, scan, and photocopy with the alumni resources. So how do you get to these? Well, we've got a page here, the University of Manitoba Alumni Users page. And so the link is just up here at the top. I'm going to open up this page and just pull it over here. So this is the Alumni Users page, and you can get, so you can see how to sign up for the library card here. And there's also a list of I mentioned you have access to some databases as an alumni person. If you click on this, you can see a list of those databases. So there's still quite a few, not as many, certainly as you had access to when you were a student. But, you know, not nothing. So hopefully this is of some use to you, and you can always recognize which ones, if you're looking through the main list of A to Z databases, you can recognize which ones are alumni access by this little A that you see here, which all of these ones are showing it, but in the main list, only a few of them would. If you ever need to get to this from the library's main page, oh, sorry, I meant to go to the libraries page. So umanitoba.ca/libraries. You can go to using the libraries, and there's this section that's not a current student, staff, or faculty member, and you can click on that to learn about the special user groups, and you'll see alumni is the first one right here. So that'll just take you to that page if you don't want to like bookmark that. Or you can just do a Google search for University of Manitoba Libraries Alumni Access, and it should pull up this page. So this is just screenshots of the same walkthrough there. So that's what we have there. There's also free use of certain databases or limited use of certain databases, which, you know, some of them might provide access to a number of articles, X number of articles per month. And this usually requires creating an account with that database. So if you have favorite databases, it's a good idea to check and see if there's any sort of free access to it for individual users to any degree. There are also some of the major vendors have free access databases. So, you know, EBSCO, for example, it has ones that are subscription only, but it also has ones that are available to anybody. These often tend to be very specialized in scope. There are also ones that are not affiliated with major vendors that can be found. A lot of those are linked in the A to Z alumni list that I showed you earlier. And then sometimes there are databases that are still searchable without having to log in through, say, a university institution, a library, or anything like that. And so they're still searchable, and some of the content in them is free, but some of it isn't. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future of this presentation. So as an example, JSTOR is one of those ones that has some free content. So right now, and this is the case at the moment with several databases, there's additional access because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So normally in JSTOR, you would be allowed to read 6 articles for free, but now you can read 100. So when you're signing up, be aware of that as well. But this one, it's showing you exactly sort of what you have to do, create a personal account. And again, you may need to do that with several databases, or may want to do that with several databases. And I'm not going to go into each of them because this presentation is tailored to, you know, a diverse group of individuals. I have no idea what fields you guys are coming from, and different databases are different or are important for different fields. So JSTOR tends to be important for the social sciences, the humanities, and like especially historical sort of things. Here's those EBSCO free databases that I was talking about. This is just a screenshot, so it's only showing a few of them, but if you scroll down, there's more to them. There's one green file that's all environmental stuff and that sort of thing. PubMed is an example of one of those databases that has open access or free content within it, but not everything is free. And so I'll show you later on how to actually find this free content in this database and others. So PubMed is, unsurprisingly, perhaps given the name, a medical and health sciences sort of database. But there is some more biological sciencey stuff in there as well. But the main thing, if you're not wanting to use a library, or even if you are, what you want to be looking for is open access content. This is sort of the best way to find scholarly information, whether or not you're affiliated with an institution, whether or not you're alumni, or whatever. So open access is like the simple version of open access is free content. But there's more to it than that. I can make a website and put something up for free, and it can be, whatever sort of garbage I want. But there's no guarantee that it'll be around for a while. There's no guarantee of peer review or any of that sort of thing. So open access scholarly content has the same rigorous standards as regular scholarly content or regular subscription-only scholarly content. It's supposed to be universally and freely accessible to everyone. This has been sort of facilitated by the advent of the internet and the growth of the internet. Now, of course, depending on your internet access situation, if you're living somewhere very remote with dodgy internet access, well, then how accessible it is varies. But the idea is that it's supposed to be universally and freely accessible to everybody. It's supposed to have long-term archiving, so it's not just Maureen's weird website that she built and decided to get rid of 2 years later. It's supposed to provide access for the long term, and it's supposed to maintain interoperability. So even as technology changes, it's supposed to allow it to continue to exist. The copyright owner, which in this case is the author, they give permission to use, copy, and distribute the publication with attribution. In traditional scholarly publishing, the copyright is transferred to the publisher. And so open access is increasingly becoming an expectation. So right now, there's quite a bit of content that is open access. That's more true in some areas than others. But funding agencies and governments are really making a push right now to say, actually, research should be freely available. It shouldn't only be limited to a specific number of people. And the funders are often, government funded, or they're funded with tax dollars and that sort of thing. And so in those cases in particular, they're like, yeah, that should be accessible to the public. So as you guys go on, as things continue to happen, more and more content will become open access. So what's available now is probably just a fraction of what's going to be available in the future. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And then there are different styles of open access content. So there's sort of the 3 big ones are green OA, gold OA, and platinum OA. So green open access is like a version of an article or a book or whatever that is different than the one that the publisher has put in the subscription access or the paid access version. Gold OA is open access to everybody. It's the publisher's version, but the author has to pay a fee before it's made open access and available to everybody. And then platinum open access is, again, it's the publisher's version. It's freely open to everybody, but nobody has to pay for it. I mention this only because depending on what type of OA you were looking at, it may have an impact with regard to what you need to pay attention to as you're reading through the material. And I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end of the presentation. So how do you find open access articles or resources? So one of the easiest ways, especially if you already have experience with the University of Manitoba libraries, is just to continue using the library page because it can be used to find open access materials. There are databases like PubMed, which I've already mentioned, that allow you to search within the results for open access specific content. And there are also browser extensions, which this is sort of the most seamless version where you can be finding articles however you would normally find articles, whether somebody's just emailed one to you and you've hit a paywall, or you've done a Google search and pulled up your own articles and this sort of thing. This one allows you to, it'll check around for another version, an open access version of what you're looking at. and we'll try to present that to you. So I'm going to talk about each one of these in more detail. The library is the simplest one to begin with. So if you go to umanitoba.ca/libraries, you will, you see the familiar library page. There's the search bar there. You put in what you want. In this case, I've decided to search for dinosaurs. And you've got all these results. And then you'll notice over on the left-hand side, there's this open access tick box. And so if you click that and then filter the results, you'll be limited to only open access resources. And so, all of these should be freely available material. And if you click on this, you'll see your standard list of databases that it's available through. Now, this is an area where you want to be a little bit careful because sometimes things are available both as open access and in a subscription database. So when deciding which one of these databases you want to click on, you want to look for the words like free or open access. And you'll notice that the second one doesn't have free or open access in it. So that one's probably a subscription only. And if I tried to access this article through that one, I wouldn't be able to get it. But that doesn't mean that I can't access it through any of these other ones. Now, one of the things about if you're coming to an open access article this way, it won't necessarily take you right to the article you want, right? So sometimes it'll just take you to like the journal repository and you have to look for that specific issue and volume and click through the issues yourself. So it's always a good idea to take a look and say like, oh, okay, this is from, 2009, it's volume 19, issue 8. Pages R318 to R323. So you may have to do a bit more digging. And that can sometimes be frustrating and off-putting. And hopefully that will become less of a problem in the future. But one of the things about open access is because it's not done for profit the way a lot of the major publishers are, their infrastructure is reliant on public funding or volunteer resources. So sometimes their ability to do these fancier tasks, I guess, is less good. But that doesn't mean that the information is not there. So if you're not taken immediately to like a PDF or directly to the article, don't give up. Just dig a little bit further. This is just a selection. There are many databases and collections of open access material. I've listed some of the bigger ones here. I'm not going to go through these all. A lot of them are pretty similar. And this is just a list. You guys, I will be sending out the slides to the folk who have registered for this one. So you don't need to go, you don't need to be writing all these down or this sort of thing. There are also specialized databases and collections of open access material. And this depends very much on your field. So this is an even smaller sample of the ones available. But I've got archive for physics and math and those guys, and Biomed Central and Public Library of Science and PubMed Central and Social Archive and that sort of thing. And these are all places where you can look around. If you have a specific field, it's worth looking for like collection, like open access collection for field or for area, because there may be very specialized ones that, that I haven't listed here, because again, I'm trying to present this in a way that is meaningful to anybody who might be signing in. And just to give you a sense of what some of these look like, this is the directory of open access journals. It's like they're all kind of similar. They've all got a search bar. The search capabilities of these open access ones are very variable. Some of the searches are very simple. Some of them allow for much more complex searching, like PubMed. A lot of times this is just, again, down to the fact that they're not for profit and they can't be spending the same amounts of money that the for-profit ones that build these powerful search engines and repositories are. With directory of open access journals, which is one of the bigger open access resources. You'll also notice that the default search is for journals. So if you put in a subject, it'll look for specific journals, but you can also search for articles, and just be aware as you're doing a search that you're going to do that. I wanted to specifically call out this one, the directory of open access books, which is obviously similar. It's got the search up in the corner there, and you can look for open access books. Now, if you looked at my list of areas and this sort of thing, you may have noticed that it was more science heavy, that it was a little bit more social science heavy, and there wasn't really humanities stuff in there. And that's not to say that there's not humanities content that's open access, but science and medicine and those guys, they've been doing the open access dance for a little bit longer. And they're also more reliant on articles, which are sort of easier to make open access, whereas the humanities tend to rely more on books and monographs. And that transition towards open access has taken longer and is still very much more in progress in the humanities, but it is happening. And directory of open access books is a great place to start looking for that sort of more humanities content that may be harder to find in the other ones. So I talked about PubMed and how it can be used to find open access materials. PubMed Advanced Search can be very powerful, but for the sake of this, I'm just going to show you if you do a search and for say syphilis and you wanted to find the open access materials, what you'd want to look for, again, it's in the filter on the left-hand side, but it's not listed as open access, and some databases won't do this. So this one lists it as free full text. So things you want to be looking for when you are trying to search a database for open access. Sometimes they list them as open access, sometimes they list them as free or synonyms like that, but free and open access are the main two ways to look for them. And full text is saying that the whole of the full text is available for access. There are also repositories and preprint servers. So I mentioned green open access, which is where you can put a version of an article or I suppose a book that's been otherwise published in a subscription-only format. And the version that is usually asked for is something called a preprint. And I've got a little chart here that shows what a preprint is. So a preprint is your manuscript, you've completed it, you've sent it off. And then it gets, peer reviewed and edited and this sort of thing. And it becomes what's called a postprint, technically, but a lot of people use preprint and postprint interchangeably. So preprint can be either step 1, the gray step, or step 2, the green step there. And then there's a copy edited typeset version that becomes the final published version that the publisher puts out. And this is the one that you're not typically allowed to stick in a repository. And so in terms of what a repository is, there are central ones or subject specific ones. But a lot of universities and institutions will also have their own repository to collect these sorts of things and other scholarly content. So we have one, it's called MSpace. If you've done a thesis or a dissertation, you will have had to stick that thesis or dissertation into MSpace if you've done it recently. If you graduated like a couple of decades ago, then maybe not. And so, yeah, if you're wanting to look for this sort of thing, either theses or these preprints, you can always be checking these repositories, which exist all over. And I mentioned one of them before, which is Archive. And Archive was kind of the original preprint server that was created in the 1990s. And that's why a lot of other ones are named after it, like MedArchive or PaleoArchive or whatever. because they're following a tradition, I suppose. This is what MSpace looks like. The content in MSpace is findable in our library resources, but you can search it here this way. And again, most repositories look kind of similar to this, right? There's the search bar. They often have collections or sections if they're an institutional one. And the page is there. I'm not going to go through this one in more detail again, unless anybody desperately wants me to, and then I suppose ask me in the chat there. But like all these, you may be getting the sense from this presentation, and you would be correct, that open access content is like, it's tucked away in these little pockets all over the place, right? And so some of the resources that I've shown you they collect a bunch of them together, or they're searching a bunch of these different repositories. And that's fine, but it can be very difficult to know where to look. And even if you do know many open access places to look, it can be frustrating to have to check so many places. And so, you know, there are some that are aggregating, like the library pages, like Directory of Open Access Journals that are pulling in from a bunch of different places. But you can also install these browser extensions if you want. What browser extensions do is you install them into your web browser, whatever it might be, Firefox or Chrome or Safari or whatever you have. And when you are on a page, like say a journal page, you've hit one of those paywalls or whatever, what these browser extensions will do is they'll scour the internet and they'll look around for an open access version. Because of Green OA and because of these funder requirements, many articles that are published in these subscription-only journals, there is a free version of them available. There is a Green OA version of them available, and so you know, it'll pop up with a little like, oh hey, why don't you check this version out instead? This one's the open access version. So open access button and unpaywall are the two big ones. They're free to use, and I don't believe you need to create an account for either of them. They are also websites that can be searched, just like the other open access repositories or databases or collections can be done as well. So you don't necessarily have to use the browser extension feature if you don't want to. Now, I'd mentioned, I'd talk a little bit more about preprints and green open access and making sure that you're using it responsibly. So because many subscription journals allow published articles to have these preprints archived in open access formats, a lot of them are, but the definition of preprint can vary, as I mentioned. So it can be either, a preprint can be either the version of the article before peer review occurred, which, depending on how extensive the peer review was, how many edits you were asked, how many changes you were asked to make, that can be quite a significantly different paper from the final published version. Or it can just be the version that doesn't have the nice copy editing, but it's already been through peer review. And often you don't know which version it is that you're looking at when you're seeing the preprint. But you should keep in the back of your mind that a preprint is not necessarily the same as the final published version. And so one of the ways that you can sort of check this out is you can see, like, first of all, was this preprint ever published? And if it wasn't published, like, it may just be that it's still in progress. This is hot new information and you're just getting the latest. Or it could be that the authors decided not to publish it, or it was rejected over and over again and just wasn't good enough to be published. But then if it has been published, you may want to check the abstract of the published version, make sure that it's saying the same things, coming to the same conclusions as the original published article, or as the preprint rather. Because maybe it was a solid article except for this one bit, and they had to remove this one bit, but that may have been a conclusion that just wasn't supported enough, so it had to be taken out. But if you're relying on that conclusion, you know, you need to be careful about that. And I would say be particularly careful about topics that are brand new or that are particularly contentious, because those are the ones that are likely to be problematic. There were several, so there was lots of, during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, there was this real push to make content that otherwise wasn't, like that otherwise would have been behind paywalls, open access, and to get it out there as quickly as possible. And so lots of people were relying on preprints that hadn't been peer reviewed yet. And they were saying, like, look what these people found. And there were a couple of cases where they're like, yeah, look what they found. That research is in fact garbage once it was analyzed, right? So there's a very recent, very real precedent for being cautious about this sort of thing. You know, if it's a less contentious topic, that's probably going to be less of a problem, or less of, you know, you should still keep it in mind. But if people aren't rushing to put out the information, or if people don't have strong opinions about something, then there's probably less likelihood of this being a real issue. So I've gone a little bit faster than I thought I would, but that is what I have. I am happy to answer questions. You can type them in the chat, or there's, you know, there's a few of us, but not a ton. So I suppose you can also like unmute or whatever if you'd like. Hopefully this was helpful. Oh yes, and there's a link here that I've got at the end. We also have a specific LibGuide for open access resources. So some of what I talked about here is available on this open access guide. There's more information about it if you're thinking of publishing open access, or if you're thinking of like, man, I wish everything was open access. You can do some advocacy, some supporting of open access. Oh, I see. I have questions here now. Let's see. Yes, so I have a question about the PowerPoint. Will there be PowerPoint? Yes, I will be emailing it to all of you guys probably later today, but possibly later in the week. I'll email you the PowerPoints. Okay, and another question. Yes, I still will be sharing the PowerPoint. So the PowerPoint will be accessible. Yeah. And well, I'm glad it was helpful. All right, well, unless somebody is madly typing away, and I will stay here for a little bit longer in case you are, but it doesn't look like there are any other questions. So I feel free to leave if you would like. I'll stick around for just a little bit in case. So there's only one person left now. I'm going to assume that you do not have any questions and you've just stepped away for a bit. But if you do, and I'm cutting you off, please feel free to either jump in immediately with your voice or send me an email at maureen.bab@umanitoba.ca. All right, have a good one.